Hey mate, Luke Ford here. My guest today is philosopher Nathan Cofnas. Nathan, in the United States, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Israeli versus Hamas conflict is just dominating the news since October 7. Is it the same way in the United Kingdom?
I don't know. I rarely leave my apartment, so but I believe so. And I've heard of protests in London and elsewhere, but I assume people are talking about it.
Why do you think there's so much interest in this war? Like, it doesn't seem to be immediate rational empirical reasons for people in the United Kingdom or the United States to have this as their number one story. Where do you think things that Israel does when Israel go to war so dominate the news?
Well, the existence of Israel is regarded as a tremendous insult by much of the Muslim world. Not something that, when Muslims kill each other frequently on a much, much, much larger scale than anything Israel has even allegedly done to the Palestinians. But that doesn't really trigger people's tribal instincts in the same way as when a Jew, stops somebody at a checkpoint and inconveniences him, or worse. And the Jews and Israel have come to represent, among the left, non-Muslims, Israel, the epitome of whiteness and privilege and ongoing colonialism. So from an ideological perspective, it makes sense that there'll be a focus on this conflict. And objectively, this has the potential to affect the world in a way that other conflicts don't. If this, theoretically, in a worst case scenario, it can draw in Lebanon and Iran, and for whatever it's worth, Russia would be supporting, would side with Iran and the Palestinians. Theoretically, China could I'm sure they're not going to seek out a direct conflict, but they could be somehow involved. You can see in how this could become basically a world war. So from that perspective, people have reason to be concerned about what's happening.
And why has this conflict seized your public attention over the last 3 weeks?
Well, for those reasons. And also Israel serves a similar psychological function that anti-Semitism used to serve. Which I'm not saying that anti-Semitism is as simple as this. There are many other reasons for anti-Semitism, but one of them is people need scapegoats. That's what unites people. That's a way for political figures to rally support, get everybody behind a cause. And now, at least in the West, for the time being, it's politically correct to use Jews, qua Jews, for that function. So you need a substitute, and the substitute in many ways, is Israel. I pointed out recently that the number 2/3 of the resolutions condemning countries in the General Assembly in the United Nations are targeting Israel. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. Even if you said Israel is guilty of everything that it's been accused of, which it's not. But even if you would say that, it still doesn't make any sense that Israel would be the subject of such intense focus by much of the world. And I think a large part of the explanation for that is Israel is the Jew among the nations.
And so, would you regard this fascination with Jews and the Jewish state, and often widespread antipathy to Jews and the Jewish state, would you regard this as primarily springing out of conflict of interests? Would you regard this as primarily something that's irrational? How would you understand the basis for this fascination and antipathy?
Well, how to define interests is a difficult problem, because is it in my interest to act on my irrational impulses? Well, all of our desires are ultimately irrational. There's no rational basis for any ultimate end that we have. So if somebody has a desire to kill all the Jews because that makes them feel good, then we disagree, or most of us disagree with that. But our disagreement is also, in a sense, irrational. We want Jews to live, they want Jews to die, and we prefer our way of seeing things, and we oppose people on the other side. But classifying their goals as irrational is maybe questionable. You can be irrational with respect to your means to achieve the goals. So if you think that you're going to make yourself richer or more organized or more successful by killing Jews or getting rid of Israel, then yeah, that's wrong. That's objectively wrong. Even if you kill all the Jews in the world and all the Israelis, that's not going to benefit very many. Many of the people who would wish for that to happen will not actually experience the benefits that they expect. So in that sense, they're objectively irrational and could be criticized. But those who just want to win in the tribal war, then that's just their feelings.
Now, is there anything about this conflict and reactions to it, Israel versus Hamas, Israel going to war in Gaza, Hamas carrying out a brutal attack, killing over 1,400 Israelis on October 7th? Anything about this conflict and the discussion of it that has most surprised you, most taken you aback?
I was surprised by the support that Israel has received in the Democrat establishment, although this is obviously being driven by the octogenarian class or septuagenarian class. If the Democratic establishment were under the control of Zoomers, then it would not be like this. But I think somebody like Biden probably sincerely cares about Jews and has a memory of the Holocaust, which doesn't really exist among the Zoomer liberal generation. They look at the video of Jews cowering in the library of what was that school in New York?
NYU, New York University.
No, it was the isn't it the Performing Arts School, the Cooper Union or something?
Okay.
I thought it was anyway, whatever it was. Now, to a lot of to boomers, that's shocking. Like, oh, Jews hiding in a room while a mob bangs on the door, because they remember, they have some memory of pogroms and the Holocaust. But to young liberals, it doesn't. They don't have those associations. It's just white people. Who cares? Now, those same boomers who care that it's Jews who are hiding in the room from the mob, they wouldn't care if they were white people, even if they were Jews, but they were being identified as white. That wouldn't bother them. So the young generation of liberals sees Jews the same way that boomers see all white people, which for boomers is shocking, but not for the new liberals.
Now, would you say that universities, either in America or United Kingdom, to the best of your knowledge, are they particularly dangerous places for Jews?
Particularly dangerous? No, I mean, not by historical standards. And I mean, if danger is defined as microaggressions, then yeah. But I mean, if you walk through a pro-Hamas rally and without making it clear that you're in favor of Hamas, then maybe you could get shoved on a campus. It's, as far as physical threats go, I think it's not likely to go beyond that in the immediate future. But there will the pro-Palestinian faction will accelerate the purge of Jews from institutions like universities. So there'll be more discrimination against Jews. Although we do have this group of people who are generally of older generations who are trying to push back against the anti-Israelism and which often borders on anti-Semitism. But they are not the future of the party. So I don't think that their influence is going to last for very much longer.
Now, discrimination against Jews in academia, how severe or how intense is this?
So Eric Kaufman published some data on this recently in surveys of faculty at elite universities. It used to be, I think, 20% Jewish. It's 20% Jewish among faculty who are older than 60 years old, and now it's around 5% Jewish for faculty under 30. So part of that is due to the fact that we're competing against Asians who are very high performers, obviously. So that's not all discrimination. And there are probably a lot fewer full-blooded Jews. There definitely are a lot fewer full-blooded Jews than there used to be. But the drop seems to have occurred much faster than could be explained by those factors. So, I mean, it's clearly applying for jobs as a Jewish academic in 2023 is very different from doing it in 1983 or 1993. You're being white is bad, and being Jewish is just makes it slightly worse.
Now, what about being, highly self-identifying as a Jew? there's like an ethnic and a religious element to that, I would think that that would largely go against university norms, at least for certain groups. It's kind of frowned upon to have an intense in-group identity, particularly on university campuses. Anything to that?
Well, if it's presented as a religious identity, I don't think people will have a problem with that per se. And there are very few people who are like there used to be Jews, especially German Jews, who thought German Jews are the best, and it was very much a racial thing. No one would get away with that nowadays. Or if somebody were said that Jews are, they're proud to be ethnically Jewish. Yeah, I don't think that would go down very well at universities.
Now, Israel is in part an ethnicity-based state, not in the sense of many fevered imaginations that it's some kind of pure ethno-state, but anyone who's Jewish has the right to move there. It is the Jewish state. One would think that this would just inherently rub leftists the wrong way, because to be on the left, does that not mean to have disdain for ethnic-based communities and states?
Well, the liberal attitude toward Israel or in any particular situation is informed by many conflicting principles and interpretations of history and that influence how they should apply those principles. And if there were a white Gentile group that had been a beleaguered minority for centuries and had been subject to persecutions, culminating in an attempted extermination, and that they then tried to go back to their historic homeland that they had left a long time ago. That would be perceived like very differently by the left than if, you know, the British just tried to set up a new colony in South America or Africa. It so happens that there's only one example of a people doing something like what the Jews did and who have that kind of experience. So, and it's not from a liberal perspective, I don't think it's not immediately obvious what their position should or shouldn't be, but the idea that there should be a place of refuge for this population, I think, could be squared with the mainstream liberal worldview. Now, as a matter of fact, Israel is a multi-ethnic country, as people who have been there know. You can come if you're just a quarter Jewish, and you can bring your family who's not Jewish at all, your completely non-Jewish spouse. There are ways of immigrating, even if you're not Jewish at all. They've given Jewish status to large groups of people whose halachic status as Jews is somewhat debatable and who have no genetic connection to other Jewish populations. So, you know, if Israel said, we're only letting in full-blooded Jews of certain ethnicities, then I don't think that would be accepted by the left. But the current policy, I think, from a leftist perspective, could be considered defensible.
Would it be fair to say that the creation of the modern state of Israel was carried out with a substantial amount of ethnic cleansing, that the founders of the modern state of Israel did not see it as in their best interest to have plenty of, Arab Muslims in their midst? So would that be a fair description of much of what happened in 1947, 48?
I mean, certainly that occurred. There were people who created incentives or moved Arabs around, as you could call it. So, yeah, I guess you could consider that ethnic cleansing. Although I would, it's interesting that people only care about, there are many people who were moved around before and immediately after World War II, including hundreds of thousands of Jews from Arab countries. And no one, or many of the people who talk a lot about the Palestinians being expelled from land that was claimed for the Jewish state, don't seem to know about or care about any of the other examples of something similar happening, including to Jews. So that would be kind of curious phenomenon that should be explained.
So there are many Jewish groups and much public Jewish discussion about what's in the best interests of Jews, very hard-headed discussion of birth rates and the relative ratio of Jews to non-Jews in the Jewish state. This would be considered, highly problematic if it was conducted by Europeans discussing, say, birth rates of Europeans versus non-Europeans in various European states. Is that fair?
Well, yeah, of course. But so there's a double standard, but there's also a reason for the double standard. Like, having consistent principles doesn't mean that you deliver the same judgment with respect to every case. You look at each case and see how the principles apply. And the Jewish experience has been very different from the experience of, say, the British. And that is one of the reasons that Israel is viewed differently from the UK, where when Jews say we need a country in order to prevent people from killing us, there's a reason people take that argument more seriously than when the British National Party says it. Because people don't have experience with British people being a minority and being killed. So people don't have the imagination to think that maybe the same protections that Jews are asking for and which they recognize are required by Jews could at some point be necessary for Brits. So maybe we would argue that that's a failure of imagination on their part, but there is a logic to that view. We know that Jews need it. We have no evidence that Brits need it. So therefore, we allow Jews to take these measures, but we don't allow Brits to. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with that. I'm just saying that's the logic, which I think has a certain kind of coherence to it.
And extending that logic would be perhaps to say that you can only understand the massacre carried out October 7th by understanding the historical experience of people living in Gaza, that it's akin to living in an open air prison, and with a hostile, foreign nation controlling much of what goes on in Gaza. Therefore, while it's universally considered revolting to massacre civilians the way that Hamas did on October 7, this occurred in a particular context of an oppressed people lashing out at their oppressors. Would that be a legitimate and fair extrapolation on what you were just talking about?
So, I mean, that explains the logic of that position. And this is an just an application of the general anti-white position, which is that the bad circumstances of non-white or people who are perceived as non-white is due to some white oppressor, and therefore they always have a right to lash out at whatever the whites that are in the vicinity, because they're by definition the oppressors, and they have to decolonize them. So yeah, that's the. But I think a more reasonable story about the context would include how we got to this situation in the first place, the total unwillingness of Arabs to accept a Jewish state, leading to wars in which Israel acquired territory and then faced continued Arab refusal to accept their existence, and Arabs electing Hamas, although that was in whatever it was, 2006, 2007, and there haven't been elections since, but still that's part of the context, is that they elected Hamas, although this was always Hamas's position that they would refuse to recognize Israel, and that they also had many opportunities to improve their condition. I saw Alan Dershowitz recently suggested that Gaza could have become like Singapore, which I think is an exaggeration, but there are Arab countries that are doing fine, and I think that if the Gazans had decided to give up on terrorism and rein in those who insisted on fighting Israel to the death, they would have been flooded with donations, and many countries establishing relations with them. Israel would cooperate with them. It's not impossible that they could have become something like Dubai, but they didn't choose that. They chose. If you look at surveys of Gazans, it's arguably a minority that support terrorism. Although I've seen surveys with different numbers, but there's just a huge percentage of Gazans who say that they want war with Israel right now. So you can't have that. The inevitable consequence of that is that Israel will respond and make life miserable for everybody. So that's just, it's their responsibility to collectively figure out if that's the route they want to take, or if they want to take a different route, and then they have to get that under control and stop forcing Israel to respond to them in a way that then they complain about.
So at Harvard University, a coalition of more than 30 student groups posted an open letter on the night of the Hamas attack saying that Israel was entirely responsible for the violence that ended up killing more than 1,400 people, most of them civilians. What's your reaction to this?
So I saw some commentators were saying, like, oh, look at what people are learning in college. Look what we teach our college students. But this has nothing to do with what's taught in college. This is about college and graduate school admissions. This is who they admit. There are people who would not have signed those letters who are more qualified than the people who did sign the letters, than the median person who signed the letters. And a lot of the signatories come from groups that benefit strongly from affirmative action. So they rejected conservative whites and Jews who would have been on the other side of this issue, and they accepted people who are pro-Hamas. So the people like Larry Summers who are confused, why did this happen? Why did Harvard end up in this place nobody expected? Because you brought all these people on campus. I couldn't go to Harvard. I was rejected from Harvard over and over again. When Larry Summers could have accepted me, they could have accepted someone like me, a lot of people with my views, then there would be, they wouldn't have this monoculture that they are now surprised about and complain about.
So I had a different reaction to this story, and I looked at my own heart. I've never lost sleep over Palestinian suffering, and Palestinians have suffered terribly. It's just that because my group is in an intense ongoing conflict with Palestinians, I tend to just save most of my emotional energy for my group. But there's nothing in me that denies that the large amount of Palestinian suffering. So I kind of expect people just to side with their own team. So I don't think these student groups really were celebrating the murder of innocent people. I think they were just instinctively siding with their team. So is instinctively siding with your team, isn't this pretty much the rule in the human condition? And we all tend to have either hero systems or ethnic or religious national loyalties, and we don't, we're not even capable of looking at them objectively, and we just instinctively side with a team. And isn't this 30 student groups at Harvard signing a petition blaming the violence entirely on Israel, isn't this just an inherent and normal part of the human condition, which on the one hand sounds absolutely barbaric, on the other hand, there's probably some evolutionary advantage in just instinctively siding with your group?
Well, people choose what group to identify with. This isn't just along racial lines. I mean, why does the LGBT group at Harvard, why would they side with Hamas? They would literally get thrown off a building. How is that their team or their group? I think the Nepali Student Association, I think maybe their representative said they signed it without reading it, which is whatever. But why would they be on Hamas's side or the Arab side? I think that this, and even Jewish groups, there are Jewish groups at Harvard that also signed it, although who knows? I mean, so many Jews now are a quarter Jewish. Even in my memory, when I was a kid, there were a lot of Jews who were half Jews. Their father was Jewish. They identify as Jews. Now it's a quarter Jewish, and they're still identifying as Jewish. I don't know if it's going to last even another generation. The 1/8 Jews. Um, I think a lot of them. I think a big issue is stereotyping Israel as white. So it's white versus slightly less white. Therefore, white is wrong. And then combined with that, Israel serves this function of being the country that everyone can agree is bad, everyone can blame for their for various problems. So the kind of the coalition of the unhappy people kind of find it natural to be against Israel, even if they would be much better off in Tel Aviv than much more welcome if they went to Tel Aviv than Gaza City.
And what do you think of these billionaires who want to know the names of these students so that they never hire them? And also, there's been a truck that's been circling around Harvard with the names and photos of students who signed the petition. This is called doxing, but they're not putting the students' addresses. So I don't think it's really a matter of doxing. But the retaliation for signing on to this kind of statement, is this cancel culture? What do you think?
So the billionaires who are behind the complaints, and they're mostly, as far as I know, all of them are boomers. So again, it suggests that the resistance is coming from that generation, and pretty soon there's going to be a large shift away from any kind of pro-Israel attitudes on the left. But is it cancel culture? I don't know. I mean, cancel culture is not really precisely defined. My feeling about it is the left has used their power to expel basically everybody that they don't like from elite institutions, while denying that there's any discrimination, any cancel culture. And now one time, a few liberals are criticized or even one Harvard student lost a job, and then Michael Eisen was removed from his position as editor of a journal, which isn't a real job anyway. And now they're crying about the new McCarthyism. And how devastated should I be about this possible infringement of free speech, given that the left has just purged all conservatives. There are basically no conservatives that can be hired now at many institutions, unless they're willing to lie and completely misrepresent their views. I don't see that as the main issue.
And say, how would you compare what happened to Michael Eisen being removed as the editor of a journal to what happened to Noah Kahl, who I believe lost his Cambridge scholarship over politically incorrect, perhaps somewhat race-based essays that he'd published?
So Noah Kahl lost an actual job. Like, he was employed by St. Edmund's College, Cambridge. And they told him, like your card doesn't work anymore, you have to leave. Michael Eisen is a tenured professor at Berkeley. There's no suggestion that is his job. There's no suggestion whatsoever that that job is in jeopardy. So his position was editor of the journal. Now, all jobs come with restrictions on your free speech. That's all jobs. It's my First Amendment right to go write on Twitter that bad things about my students and call them names and whatever. But I'm not allowed to do that, and I shouldn't be allowed to do that because my job is to respect my students. So the job of journal editor also comes with restrictions on speech. You have to, the job of the journal editor is to be impartial and make people feel confident that he's going to treat them fairly. And that may not be consistent with all social media activity that would otherwise be protected by the First Amendment. So this is a very much a gray area. And it's also important to note that the right-wing version of Michael Eisen would never have been a journal editor in the first place. He would never be maybe he could have been hired 30, 40 years ago, but certainly not in the last 10 or 20 years at Berkeley. And as I pointed out yesterday, in 2019, there was a search for a assistant professor in the life sciences at Berkeley, which is where Michael Eisen works. And the first round of cuts to the applicant pool was made based on their diversity statement. And the university Human Resources published the guidelines for scoring diversity statements. So if you say that you treat everyone equally or whatever, then you fail. You get the lowest mark possible on the diversity statement. And in order to get a sufficiently high mark, you have to go all out about how diverse your whole life is, and your research and everything is all about diversity and equity. So just a loyalty oath to wokeism, that's far more extreme than the infamous loyalty oaths in the McCarthy era, where you said that you're not a member of any organization that seeks to violently overthrow the US government, including the Communist Party, which they'd want to violently overthrow the US government. So those were the terrible McCarthy era oaths that we're always hearing about, how bad that was. But now it's much, much worse. Now 76% of the applicants for that job were automatically disqualified because of their political views on wokeism. They failed the diversity statement. Michael Eisen didn't say anything about that. None of his free speech defenders said anything about that. Nobody cared. Now, in that case, that was clearly a violation of free speech and academic freedom. Your views on equity and diversity have absolutely nothing to do with your research in life sciences, and they're not relevant to doing your job, which is to treat people equally, which is exactly what they said would be a failing answer for the diversity statement. So that's just a way of weeding out people with political views that they don't like. Now, if you're a journal editor, should you go around insulting large groups of people and being very politically inflammatory, saying, using profanity with regard to certain countries where many authors that would submit to your journal live? Should you be doing that? That's very questionable. And the statement released by the journal's publisher said that they were firing Michael Eisen because of a pattern of behavior on social media. So it wasn't just one tweet where he retweeted the Onion article. But he's generally been very unprofessional on social media, and I can understand why that would be an issue for his ability to perform his duties associated with that job. Now, the main petition that objects to the firing of Michael Eisen says that it would be appropriate to fire the journal editor if he was racist, if he engaged in hate speech. So these are Michael Eisen's defenders. In other words, you could fire Michael Eisen if he were a conservative, because mainstream conservatism is associated with views that liberals consider hate speech. So basically all conservatives will be considered purveyors of hate speech by Michael Eisen's defenders. So they want to keep their guy and fire everybody else. So this, from their perspective, this has nothing to do with free speech at all.
So these are shocking events beginning on October 7, and now we're getting close to 10,000 Palestinians dead, and yet my worldview hasn't changed 1 millimeter. These shocking events just confirm my worldview. I assume that these shocking events just confirm your worldview, and it sure seems when I look around and watch and listen and read pundits that these shocking events just confirm everybody's worldview. Am I right that these events have only confirmed your worldview? And two, why is it that we have shocking events and they don't seem to change many people's worldview?
Well, as I mentioned, I was surprised by some of the support that Israel has received. So I did have to make some adjustments and I was also, like everybody, I was surprised by the performance of Shin Bet and Mossad and the IDF, and that was really confusing. I'm still not sure how to interpret that failure and understand what it means. Some of these events have made me rethink some things, but we already knew that the left was on the side of the Palestinians, and that they were in principle open to violence in the service of decolonization. So as far as that goes, I don't think there was much to be surprised about.
Are you a Zionist?
I mean, my understanding of Zionism is that it's the ideology that calls for Jews all over the world to gather in Israel, and I live in Cambridge and Seoul, so it seems to me that disqualifies me from being a Zionist. And I married a non-Jewish woman, and I think Jewish continuity and contributing to Jewish continuity is an element of Zionism, as I understand it. So it would be very strange for me to call myself a Zionist. But I support the Jewish state in principle. I support the idea of Jews having a state, and specifically in their historic homeland. And I think that they have a moral claim according to commonly accepted moral principles to that land. So if that's what Zionism means, then I guess so. But
Do
it's
you
not
think
how
that, do you think the Jews have any more moral claim to that land than the Arabs who, let's say, we'll talk about the Arabs who lived there for, say, hundreds of years in that geographic area that's now the Jewish state of Israel?
So I think that according to common sense or commonly accepted moral principles, Jews have a very strong claim to that land. They were forced out. They never gave up their claim to ownership for 1800 years. They pray 3 times a day facing that piece of land wherever they are. They pray every day to return to the land. So there is an idea in certain legal systems that if you give up some property and somebody else acquires it, or a piece of land, that the new owner, the new occupant, has rights over the land. But that doesn't apply if you continually protest. So if they forcibly take something from you and you protest and you protest and you protest, you protest, as far as I know, there's no legal or moral system which says that they acquire it no matter how much time passes, that they would be able to acquire it if they're forcibly occupying it against your protest. And I don't think that it would be a reasonable principle to say that people are allowed to steal anything they want, and then even though you continue protesting, if enough time passes, then they would be able to be the rightful legal owner. This is a bit complicated in the case of Jews versus Arabs, because in terms of like genetic similarity to the ancient Israelites, it's quite likely that the Palestinians share more genetic code than, say, Ashkenazi, and even possibly by descent as well. Many Arabs in that region are presumably descended from Jews, but Jews who gave up being Jewish and who only survived by adopting a different religion and essentially giving up the claim that their ancestors had made to the land. So I mean, that is kind of I think that does introduce an element of complexity into the moral analysis, but I think the Jews have a strong claim. I don't deny that Arabs also have a claim. I'm not saying that there's no claim whatsoever to having lived somewhere for centuries. They're not the ones who stole the land. They're not the Romans who kicked the Jews out in the 2nd century. So that's not their fault, and now they're being punished for this. If the Arabs are now expelled, they're being punished for a crime committed a long time ago by different people. So that also is something that would have to be considered. So I don't think that common sense morality would dictate that Jews should just come in and kick everyone out. But I think the claim that Jews have needs to be weighed against the claims of others.
And do the claims of Arabs whose ancestors lived in the land that is now the Jewish state of Israel and whose parents and grandparents were, let's just to make the example more dramatic, were, say, forcibly expelled from what is now Israel, do they not have a very strong claim to the land as well?
Well, they have a claim. Jews have a claim. So, and then Jews collectively may also have a claim to a Jewish state. And that claim then could be violated by bringing in large numbers of non-Jews. So, there's no objective answer to how these questions should be decided, or which claim you judge to be stronger. But
right.
The vast majority of Israelis are willing to accept living on a small fraction of what was their original homeland in exchange for peace. Now, there are obviously Zionists who want everything, and but if there were a real prospect of peace, the Israelis would definitely get those people under control, and they would not be sitting at the border with the Arab countries, firing rockets at them and trying to massacre their civilians. So a compromise that would respect the claims of everyone to some degree would include a Jewish state that was much smaller than the original mandate for Palestine and their original homeland of Eretz Israel.
Do you have a more intense Jewish identity now as a result of the October 7 attacks?
No, I don't think so. Because it's not. I always have cared about the existence of Israel. I think it's a good thing to have the Jewish state, and I have some connection being with that, being Jewish myself. So I'm paying more attention to it now that the Jewish state is under threat in a way that it hasn't been for a long time. And I think the prospect of another extermination of Jews, while not likely, is at least conceivable in a way that it wasn't just a few weeks ago. And I would be interested in preventing that.
So obsessive is a very common put down used against people who have more interest in a particular topic than the descriptor thinks is appropriate. What's an adaptive and appropriate level of interest in Jews and the Jewish state for, say, non-Jews?
Well, that depends what their goal is. If their goal is to get a lot of Twitter followers or start a kind of fringe dissident movement, then being openly anti-Semitic is a very good idea, because that would advance the goal. If they want to um, get status among the mainstream left, then they can focus on Israel and why Israel is bad. Now, but then for the average person, like, will the average person's life become better by killing Jews or killing all the Jews in Israel and getting rid of Israel? Then no, clearly not at all. The world would become a worse place if for the vast majority of people, possibly even for many of the Palestinians themselves, if Hamas or something like Hamas um, is allowed to establish a state on the ashes of Israel. The lot of the average Palestinian could well become much worse. Although maybe they would prefer to be terrorized by someone who looks like them rather than somebody who looks slightly different and who is Jewish, because that's human nature. But yeah, a lot of this stuff I think is irrational to the extent that it's motivated by either false beliefs about Israel or false beliefs about the wonderful benefits that would come from getting rid of Israel.
We hear a lot about anti-Semitism. Is there such a thing as anti-Gentilism among Jews?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, why not? I mean, in this respect, I don't think there's a big difference between Jews and Gentiles. I mean, Jews, there are many Jews who quit being Jewish and then join the pogromists. And there are many Jews who support the most vicious, genocidal anti-Israelism. And within the Jewish community, I mean, Gentiles have there can be anti-Gentile attitudes that are just rooted in bigotry, and the same reason that Gentiles look for other people to blame. Jews would blame Gentiles, and it feels some people are going to feel good when they hate others. So there are certainly Jews like that.
So you have a tweet that Jews have some responsibility for the diversity golem that is beginning to turn on them. Is there any significant difference between, say, Jewish attitudes to diversity and political correctness and, say, WASP attitudes towards diversity? I mean, I think when you account for levels of secular education and or IQ, there don't seem to be many differences in political attitudes between WASPs and Jews.
Yeah, there was WASP. WASP self-hatred was very much a thing that developed without Jewish influence. WASP, there was a generation of WASP intellectuals who decided that WASPs are boring and everybody else is more exciting, and we need more non-WASPs, and it's embarrassing to be WASP. Then Jews also kind of jumped on this bandwagon, and they continue, and they help promote these ideas, obviously. But a lot of the Jewish support for diversity was rooted in a similar kind of self-hatred as it was in WASPs, this is against the McDonald narrative. narrative, that it was a plan to advance Jewish interests. I mean, obviously, there were some Jews who thought that um, one of the benefits of this movement would be that there would be less anti-Semitism, but for for the most part, Jews have identified as white, and Jewish liberals see themselves as among the bad guys, but they didn't anticipate, and they just didn't take non-whites seriously. I think they thought that they would always be under the control of the white liberal intellectual class, um, and they could have some Black Panther kind of groups, but that was just kind of cute acting out, not something that they took really seriously. And yes, this is the golem that now is turning on them.
Supporters of Israel have often decried Palestinians not trying to achieve their means through peaceful means. And then Palestinians and their supporters developed BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction, which is a nonviolent way of promoting the Palestinian agenda. So do you see BDS as a legitimate tool, or do you think BDS is something that needs to be opposed?
So I disagree with the end, obviously, and engaging in, if we're going to have norms of political discourse and negotiation, having people gang up on the group that you don't like to deprive them of basic material needs is very questionable. That we want to live in a world where people act like that. So generally, we agree not to do that kind of thing. It's like taking away the credit cards of the bank accounts of racists. Even though in many cases I probably disagree with the people whose bank accounts were taken away. I don't agree with that tactic, because we should try to create conditions where we can resolve things in a peaceful, rational way. And BDS, basically an act of war. So then I guess we're not, if it's a war, then there's no more negotiation, and you just fight with all the means available. But that I think is not really desirable.
But doesn't that then reveal that was just empty posturing when supporters of Israel asked for Palestinians to develop nonviolent means of pursuing their cause? Then Palestinians do exactly that, and you couldn't overstate the opposition to BDS from pro-Israel sources. So does that not show that the call by pro-Israel supporters for Palestinians to develop nonviolent means of pursuing their goals, that was just empty posturing?
Well, I'm not familiar with those calls for Palestinians to adopt nonviolent means. So if the Palestinian goal is the destruction of the state of Israel, and you say adopt nonviolent means to achieve your goal, then that would be absurd, because the goal could only be achieved through violence. So why would you say to adopt means that could never work to achieve your goal. If somebody said that, then yes, that would be just posturing.
And what about a one-state solution where, Arabs, Palestinians, Israelis, Jews live together in one state that will be demographically tipping Arab? Do you think that would be a humanitarian disaster, or do you think that would be a moral improvement on the current situation?
Well, there would just be 15 million people murdering each other. I don't see how anyone could think that's desirable. I guess Jews would probably be the losers in that scenario. I think the Arabs would kill more Jews than in hand-to-hand combat. There would be more Arabs coming in. I mean, a lot of Jewish peaceniks wouldn't last that long. So that would just be giving everything to the Arabs, including the lives of all the Jews living in Israel, is the most likely outcome.
Are there any critics of the Jewish state of Israel who you accord respect?
I don't know. If you suggest some names, maybe I could comment on them. I'm not that interested in the day-to-day commentary about, why did Israel confiscate this well, and what was the principle, and was the well was dug illegally, but did they have some reason why they dug the well? And that's a lot of like Israel commentaries about that kind of thing, which I see as kind of not very closely related to the core moral issue, which is what I'm interested in, which is who has a claim to the land, and in principle, should you have a right to defend yourself against the kind of aggression that we've seen. So, I mean, I think the most interesting challenge to Israel is the idea that the Palestinians really are the indigenous people of this land, that they're descended, that they have a closer connection to, by descent, to the Israelites than than Jewish populations, people who identify as Jewish. So maybe that would be the only, one of the few critiques of the Israeli position that I think deserves to be thought about. But most of the stuff,
No, go ahead, finish your point.
But most of the stuff that people say about Israel turns out to be very questionable or just made up, in my experience.
So, do you have history with Israel? Have you visited? Have you spent much time there?
I spent about a year in Israel. I studied at the yeshiva in Jerusalem.
And how did that affect you? And how does that continue to affect you, if at all?
I learned about Judaism. I was motivated to sign up for my first philosophy course due to the influence of one of the rabbis there, who had been a tenured professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins University, specializing in the philosophy of mathematics, but then became a Bostoner Chassid and then a rabbi, and he quit academia and now teaches in the yeshiva. Very smart guy. I guess it was, I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, so I hadn't really met anyone with radically different views from everybody I knew, and everybody was basically some kind of liberal, uh, atheist. A lot of people went to Hebrew school, but of course that was just a joke. Even the rabbis were atheists at the Reformed temples. Now, when I went to Israel, my understanding of Judaism was based largely on personal study, and I was very influenced by Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, and that was my understanding of Judaism when I arrived in Israel. And then it was really a shock to discover how different authentic Judaism was from my understanding, and the fact that people actually believed these things that are so different from what I believed and what anyone I knew believed. And that was a learning experience. I think a lot of liberals who spent their whole life in a liberal environment, they think deep down everybody's a liberal, everybody is like them, and they don't have the imagination to understand that some people really are different, and they really have different and totally incompatible beliefs. And I was like that when I was 17, and then when I was 18, I went to Israel, and I was able to recognize that bias, and so that was valuable.
To what extent, if at all, does your Jewish identity blind you to objective reality of the Arab-Israeli conflict?
I don't. When it comes to objective facts, I don't think I have any. I don't see what the biases are. If somebody shows me evidence that Palestinians are more closely descended from Israel, related to Israelites than I am, or other Jewish groups, I don't. There's no resistance. That's very bad news for the Zionist position. That creates complexities, unwelcome complexities for the Zionist position. I have no problem accepting those things as soon as somebody suggests them, presents evidence. When Israel has expels Palestinians, the fact that Palestinians were expelled from Israel, which is an inconvenient fact, doesn't no problem for me to acknowledge that. So I don't know what I can't. How can I say there's no bias? I just don't see it. I don't have any reason to feel that I'm biased.
I think the American news media and America as a nation and American discussions about Israel tend to lean much more in a pro-Israel direction than what happens in Europe. Have you noticed a difference? For example, I believe that Zionist is largely considered a dirty word in Europe. Zionist is not considered a dirty word in the United States.
Yeah, I do sometimes watch clips of the BBC and Channel 4, and yeah, they're definitely anti-Israel. Muslims have a lot more influence in the UK, and I assume in Europe as well, than Jews do. So I suspect that Muslims have the kind of influence in the UK that Jews have in America. That would be my impression.
Would you agree that the American news media presents a pro-Israel slant more often than not, and that American politics is somewhat influenced by the Israel lobby. Do you agree that there is an Israel lobby in the U.S.?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the mechanics of the Israel lobby. I mean, there are a lot of um, uh, so I can't comment on the details of that, but I know there are a lot of interest groups that are pro-Israel in the United States for various reasons. Christian support for Israel is certainly important, and I don't. My impression is that this level of pro-Israelism would not exist if it weren't for the Christian evangelical attitudes toward Israel. But I mean, of course, politics is influenced by lobbying groups on both sides. So yeah.
So it was surprising to me after 9/11 that there wasn't an upswell in anti-Israel sentiment, given that Osama bin Laden said one of the reasons he attacked the U.S. on 9/11 was because of American support for Israel. Plenty of people like John Mearsheimer have made the case that American support for Israel is not good for America. Certainly seems to have played a role in precipitating 9/11 attacks. Now we've got President Joe Biden flying to Israel in a time of war, which is virtually unprecedented. I can't imagine any other major American politician doing something. We've got two major aircraft carriers moving through the Mediterranean closer to Israel. Do you have any concerns that the pro-Israel lobby has been so effective that it has steered American policy against America's best interests?
Well, first, I would question what America's interests are. What does that mean? I mean, as far as I can tell, the interests of America just refers to there is no interest of America. There's Americans, and Americans are interested in various things. Some of them are interested in Israel. So that would be part of what happens. Some of them are interested in Ireland. Some of them are interested in Italy or Saudi Arabia. So a lot of Americans would care what if Israel were wiped off the map, and so therefore that counts toward American interest. However you want to add up all of that interest. And I mean, clearly Israel is an ally of the U.S. in a region where some other countries are not allies, and there's some benefit, although I'm sure that the Israel lobby may exaggerate it, but that doesn't sound like a completely hallucinated benefit to the U.S. beyond the interest that many Americans have in Israel for its own sake. And if Israel were, it's like the war in Ukraine, which I think the liberal establishment has played this. It looks like they ended up playing this really well, although it has been and still is a very dangerous situation. And I think even now we're probably closer to nuclear war than we've ever been since World War II. I mean, we came very close during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but even then, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, neither side wanted nuclear war. But now, in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, it's becoming almost rational, or there's some scenarios where it may even be rational for Russia to use nuclear weapons. But assuming we win this round of Russian roulette, then I think the liberal establishment will come on top, having supported Ukraine and now defeating Russia and discrediting the Russian political system and also intimidating China. And a similar result, I think, would occur if Israel comes out victorious with the support of the United States.
Do you think there can be any lasting peace without giving Palestinians their own independent state? And I don't mean Egypt, Syria, Jordan, but their own independent state.
So the thing is, they already have two independent states, which are Syria and Jordan, and those were Palestine. There's no ethnic difference. But okay, if they want a third state, the problem with that is, at least in surveys, a huge percentage say that they don't accept Israel's right to exist. So what's the point of setting up a Palestinian state if 30% of the population is going to be calling for war forever, because as long as there is any Jewish state at all. And that 30% of the population will be lined up on the border firing rockets, and Israel will have a fence, and every so often they'll be able to breach the fence and go and massacre civilians. I don't see how peace is, how creating a third Palestinian state would make that much of a difference to the peace process.
Let me challenge you. I assume you don't believe that there is an essentialism to Palestinians or to Jews, that, for example, that Palestinians, a substantial portion of them, are just inherently violent people. To whatever extent they want to destroy a Jewish state, isn't that a product of contingent circumstances? Change the circumstances and you'll change the people? Or do you believe that there are inherent qualities of a predisposition to violence among a substantial portion of the Palestinian people?
Well, I think that if you exchanged the average Palestinian child and the average Israeli child, if they got mixed up in the hospital and one was raised in Gaza and one was raised in Tel Aviv, that they would basically act like the people in their environment. I don't think that I'm sure there are genetic differences on average that give them different dispositions, but they're not, enormous. Although even small differences might then be amplified on a population level. But leaving that aside, yeah, in principle, there's no question that Palestinians could be brought up with a different ideology that didn't lead to this result. The question is it possible to create those conditions where they would grow up differently without you could, but to do that, it seems you would have to either raise them not to be Muslim or to have no cultural memory of previous events. So I don't see practically how that's going to work. Yes, in principle, everybody could be raised, or at least Israelis and Palestinians could be brought up with some different ideology that didn't lead them to fight with each other. I just don't see the path to getting there.
Okay, so when we know that someone is a Jew or we know that someone is a Muslim, we know almost nothing about them, even if we're talking about 10,000 Jews and 10,000 Muslims, because Muslims in Southeast Asia are very different from Pakistani and Afghan Muslims, like Muslims all around the world, very different from each other. So too, Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews, they're about as different as Scandinavians and indigenous Mexicans. So would you agree with that? That just knowing that you've got large numbers of a group of Jews or a large number of a group of Muslims, you really don't know anything unless you know further details about them, because Jews and Muslims vary so much.
You mean in terms of their genetic predispositions?
Well, just forget genetics, just real world life outcomes. Mizrahi Jews and Ashkenazi Jews have very different real world life outcomes for whatever reason. And so too, Muslims in South Asia, for example, create very different communities than, say, Muslims in Afghanistan or Pakistan. So I'm just making, I guess, the liberal left argument that there's some wisdom to their idea that there's no such thing as an essential Islam or an essential Judaism or Jewish identity. It depends upon time and place, and the makeup of the people.
Right. So I'm talking about the Palestinian people, that population. And Islam varies. The interpretation of Islam, varies to some extent, but there is a common core. And I don't think there's any mainstream interpretation of Islam that would welcome a Jewish state on what was previously Muslim-controlled land. So, hypothetically, they could come up with a new version or a radically new interpretation of Islam that makes all this okay. And maybe that's not even so far-fetched, because there are some Arab countries that are apparently willing to make peace with Israel. But when we're talking about the people who actually lived, who are descended from the people who were actually living on that land, then it might be harder for them to accept the Jewish state than it is for Egyptians or Saudi Arabians.
Would you agree that circumstances are just as likely to predict behavior as genetics? Meaning nurture and environment, situation, shape behavior approximately as much as genetics?
Well, there's no such thing as genetics or environment. There's an interaction of genetics and environment.
So precisely, the environment does profoundly affect how people express themselves. So change the situation, you change people. For example, if you're running late to an important appointment, I can predict all sorts of behavioral traits that you will have if you're running late to. You will not, tend to be empathic and kind and generous. You will be very driven to get to your important appointment. And so that's just a particular situation where people, when they're late to an important appointment, they tend to demonstrate certain traits because the situation has changed. So I don't find it outlandish to believe that if you simply change the situation for Palestinians, that many of these desires to slaughter Jews will change.
Yeah, I think there is a possible world where the 2006 elections had gone differently and they went down a different path and they started to experience more prosperity, and then this kind of, they realized that a large part of the population realized that this was a more promising route than endless war with Israel. Yeah, I guess that could have happened, but starting from right now, because this is not 2006, in 2023, we're a very long way away from creating conditions where that choice will even realistically be possible.
George Gilder wrote a book in 2009 called The Israel Test. He says the Israel Test is a moral challenge. It can be summarized by a few questions. One, what is your attitude toward people who excel you, whether in the creation of wealth or in other accomplishments? Two, do you aspire to their level of excellence or do you seethe at it? And three, do you admire and celebrate exceptional achievement or do you impugn it and seek to tear it down? The Israel Test, do you think this is an important moral challenge?
Yeah, I do. I don't. For most people, the morality of resentment doesn't have a lot of payoffs, so they should probably would be advised to reject it.
So you're fairly active on Twitter. Are there any interlocutors who particularly have your respect or who you feel you've learned from?
I've learned a tremendous amount from Twitter about all sorts of things. I get a lot of information from Twitter. I've learned a lot about communication. It's interesting to see how people interpret what you say immediately after you write it. My work on Jews was significantly informed by conversations with all sorts of people on Twitter. So, yeah, I like Twitter. I don't know if I want to single out particular individuals, but the whole exchange and interaction I find interesting.
A lot of people can't handle Twitter. They end up tweeting things that ruin their lives. Any guidance on the responsible use of Twitter, particularly for academics?
A lot of people err on the side of caution, I think. We don't hear about those cases because the Chronicle of Higher Education doesn't write an article about, academic refrains from tweeting his opinion, that kind of vanilla opinion about some topic because he's so afraid of any kind of criticism. But for people who are bolder than that, obviously be careful of sarcasm, jokes, because these can be interpreted in ways that you don't even expect. People being active on Twitter teaches you about people's capacity for misunderstanding and misinterpretation in a way that you wouldn't otherwise really understand. Obviously, be careful about criticizing individuals, especially if the individual can be considered lower status than you. That's important if you're an academic. But I think, yeah, most people I would encourage to be more bold and take more risks. And if you do tweet, this applies not only to Twitter, but in all areas of life. If you do take a controversial position, don't be apologetic about it. Don't deny that you said it. Don't use weasel words to give yourself plausible deniability and then when people accuse you of saying what we all know you meant to say, then you say, no, I never would say that. Actually, a lot of cancellations, probably people are much, I would definitely, people are more likely to be canceled if they try to, if they apologize and try to pretend that they don't believe what they believe and or they didn't say what they said. So so if you just if you are confident in what you believe and you say it clearly, um, there's less risk than people often realize. A lot of people um, think that they're going to be canceled if they like a tweet about a controversial topic, or if um, they say anything, you know, anything at all controversial. It's really, uh, yeah, that rarely happens.
What do you think is the realistic potential for Palestinian IQ? Let's say they get a situation that is conducive to their thriving. We have various surveys putting Palestinian IQ around 85, surely getting into the 90s in a more optimal circumstance. Do you think that's a reasonable assumption?
So obviously they're not reaching their IQ potential right now. So whatever the data say now is less than what it could be. I mean, my best guess would be something in the mid 90s, but it's very we just don't have the data to answer that question, and it's very hard or impossible to make to compare the innate intellectual capacity of populations based on country level IQ, because then that's so sensitive to environmental factors, and you have to compare population representative samples of people who are raised under comparable environments, ideally in the same environment for as much as possible, like um, African Americans and white Americans, or ideally including cross-racial adoption studies. You can't just give people in Gaza an IQ test and draw conclusions from that. So I don't know. My guess would be in the mid 90s, because that's sort of the trend for people in the region, but I don't know what it really is.
So you quote tweet a Jewish leftist, A. Graby. He says, I don't think non-Jews really grasp that Jewish people's fundamental social trust has been permanently undermined. We now know that our company's DEI officers would gleefully celebrate our deaths if we were killed by the right people. And you summarize his tweet accurately. Jews now know that DEI means it's okay to kill Jews. This changes everything. And then a few hours later, he says, I'm never going to stop respecting pronouns and voting for the Democrats because conservatives are racist. Do you think that the events of October 7 and their aftermath are going to change many minds on the Jewish left?
The thing is, white liberals have been targeted, maybe not quite like this, but on a smaller scale, this has happened to white liberals. There are many cases of atrocious hate crimes against whites, and that doesn't seem to have changed anything in the white Gentile liberals' minds. So it's possible that liberal Jews will be similarly resistant, although a lot of Muslims, non-white Muslims, and blacks don't have the same hangups about using the word Jew specifically to describe what they don't like, whereas there's a big taboo on saying anything bad about Jews per se in the old-fashioned liberalism. So, I mean, if they're openly saying that they hate Jews and even using the word Jew, if we get to that point, which I think is possible, I'm not saying we definitely will, but I think it's possible that in a few years we could start seeing more of that. Then I feel like there has to be some response. The liberal Jews can't deny reality to that degree, I think, but we'll see. Now, the young generation of Jews might be more open-minded. I mean, these Jewish, liberals, the boomer liberals, it doesn't matter if they're being beheaded by Hamas. Their last words will be about the Trump Nazis, anti-Semites they're responsible for this. Right? So there's nothing you can say to them. They will never give it up. But among Zoomer liberal Jews, maybe I think it will be a different story. But they'll be much less influential than Jews were in the past, because first, there are a lot fewer Jews than there used to be. And they're not going to have much influence on the left anyway, so they're not going to be very high profile. If they try to construct some new non-anti-Semitic version of leftism, they're not going to have that much influence. So they could join, some of them will join the conservative movement, and they're likely to be more visible in the coming generation. So I recently wrote an article about this called Twilight of the Liberal Jew, where I suggest that over time, the prominent Jews are going to be more and more conservative, which we already see to some extent, like among the most prominent Jews under the age of 40, like Ben Shapiro and the Libs of TikTok woman.
Do you have any thoughts on the repercussions of the U.S. Supreme Court ruling effectively banning explicit race-based affirmative action in college admissions?
Well, you're still allowed to write about race in your essay. So that's a big loophole, because everyone's going to write about race in their essay, and then that will be used. People who write about race, about being Black, will be scored as having great essays. And I doubt that if admissions were just based on meritocracy, there would be almost no Blacks at top universities. I don't think that this will be accepted. People cannot accept this. They'll find some way of bringing them there.
Anything going on in either a positive or a negative direction with Jonathan Haidt and Heterodox Academy?
So, as people may know, I wrote an article, 4 Reasons Why Heterodox Academy Failed, which got some attention earlier this year. So a lot of people agreed with the critiques. A lot of people are not happy about the performance of Heterodox Academy, which is obviously became controlled opposition. They purged everybody doing actually controversial work, and they just promote sort of mainstream liberals who talk about their supposed commitment to free inquiry, but nobody's actually saying anything controversial. No controversial people are actually invited or allowed to give talks there. But there wasn't, um, although a lot of people agreed with me, then not much happened afterwards. I wrote a follow-up article called How to Take Back Academia, which I thought was more important than the original article because it explained what actually we need to do, but that got much less attention, and hopefully people discover it in the future, because I think this is the only way to take back academia, is to follow the plan that I described in that article. That was published in Dorian Abbott's Substack. This is called Heterodox STEM. Certainly, the current strategy is not working at all. It will never work. But that's, people want to stick with doing what's comfortable.
And do you see any positive signs of moving in the direction of taking back the academy?
No, not at all.
Now,
what are we doing? I mean, we've done nothing. I mean, the Supreme Court decision was nice, but if you have dissident views, you can't be hired by a normal department. Journals are basically captured entirely. We don't have anyone on campus to push back. And the only somewhat positive development is, in some red states, they've created these special institutes at universities that are supposed to be conservative friendly, but without getting into the details, I mean, a lot of them have been taken over by wokesters as soon as they're created, or they're not really focusing on what I would consider to be the important issues. So, yeah, it's not looking good.
And how do you like this definition of woke, that certain groups should be off limits to public criticism?
No, I don't. I'm not sure I agree with that. There have always been groups that are off limits to criticism. So, and if you said that white heterosexual males are off limits to criticism, then that would conform to the definition, but that wouldn't be anything that we recognize as woke. So my understanding of wokeism is that it's what logically follows from taking the equality thesis seriously and combined with certain widely accepted moral assumptions. So you think everybody is literally the same. So a African American in the inner city has exactly the same average potential as a Korean born in Silicon Valley. It's exactly the same, and the different outcomes are the result of some sort of social forces. Then it follows that the most urgent moral project is to correct this environmental forces that are causing the terrible outcomes among certain groups, especially Blacks and other certain minorities. And so then this leads to fighting racism. And once you've gotten rid of all the racism that you can identify, but the disparities are still there, so you need to look for more hidden racism. And maybe it's the microaggressions. You use the wrong facial expression when you talk to a black person, or it's the statue. There's a picture of a white man, and the white man had politically incorrect views about race. So maybe that influences certain people not to perform as well. You're led down this path just based on belief in the equality thesis. So that's why any opposition to wokeism that doesn't attack the equality thesis is not gonna work.
So you know many dissident intellectuals with some similarity in worldview to yourself. Some of them, when they receive public attention, they fold, they disappear, they delete all their heterodox publications to the extent possible. Others seem to be able to, navigate from an outside perspective. Seems, a reasonable life. What can you tell me about dissident intellectuals? How they dissident intellectuals, largely in line with your own research and worldview. What can you tell me about how they manage to navigate a reality that's frequently hostile to them?
Well, of course, academia selects strongly for timidity and conformity, and at every level, from kindergarten to grade school, college, graduate school, professorship. Uh, you're rewarded for adopting the popular view and flattering your professors and doing your homework and not making trouble. So that selects for a certain kind of personality, which isn't necessarily the kind of personality that would lead you to take a position on a controversial topic and say what you think is true, even though people are going to say mean things about you, or even try to expel you from the academy. Now there is that filtering mechanism, and it is much harder to make it in academia if you behave that way. I've been there's certainly been an element of luck in my ability to make it as far as I have. I could easily, at certain critical moments, have been unlucky, and then I'm not sure what would have happened. But people just need to start to, I don't know, does it help for me to say this? But people just need to stop being afraid to realize that they may have to pay some personal cost to taking a stand, but it's worth it. The cost will be real, although it may be less than they anticipate. I think to be an intellectual in the style that I aspire to be, one has to be comfortable with the possibility of being in the minority and being potentially ostracized. Now, as a matter of fact, I have many friends, and I don't feel ostracized. But if I didn't have many friends, I would still do the same thing. Even if everybody were against me, I would say what I believe. I can't teach people to have my personality, but I would encourage people to recognize that the consequences of speaking the truth are not necessarily as bad as they think. And if everyone starts doing it, then there will actually be a change.
Well, I would hope that you would only encourage certain people to start saying unpopular truths, because a great deal of people simply don't have a life situation or the personality that's cut out for being ostracized.
So academia selects for conformity, which is, of course, the opposite of what it should select for. But it would be very hard to select for the opposite of conformity, because whatever you're selecting for, I mean, then you create incentives to be like, to meet the criteria that you established, and so only conformists then would meet the new criteria. So I don't know. Maybe it's impossible to not select for conformity. But you also have to practice taking. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with being disliked, and I have, in many cases, put myself in a position where I knew that I would be surrounded by people who don't like me and who disagree with me, and that would feel uncomfortable, and that was healthy to develop the habit of being able to do that. So there was a certain amount of training involved, and I think that this is one of the ideas behind the the ritual when the priests in the Bible are being confirmed into the priesthood. There's a ritual where this was what precipitated the Korach rebellion. They're shaved and then they're waved. I guess they're held up and waved. And one of the comments on this is that they looked ridiculous, that this whole procedure looked ridiculous. But that was to teach them a lesson that if you were going to be a leader, then you need to be willing to seem ridiculous, and to have people maybe laugh at you or look down on you. So I think that there's a deep lesson there.
How big of a problem is it that it tends to be socially marginalized and antisocial people who are low in agreeableness who are most attracted to socially marginalized intellectual endeavors? And so if you've got ideas that are on the margins, it will tend to be marginalized antisocial people who will be most likely to take them up, and therefore such people will tend to be really poor public representatives of such ideas.
Yeah, I've been meaning to write an article on this topic. This is a very important phenomenon, that once you take something that's maybe obviously true, obviously correct, but you make a taboo out of it, then who is going to tell the truth about this thing? It will be people who are so disturbed that they don't even know what they're doing. There'll be people who are just trying to provoke a reaction. People who maybe are attracted to the thing for actually bad motives. They have some ulterior reason. And then the last category would be people who actually are interested in the truth and are. And then another important category is people who want to make a name for themselves, but they can't compete with in the mainstream, so they would rather swim in this smaller pond of people who produce commentary about the taboo topic, and so that they can at least be big fish in this smaller community. And then when outsiders look at this, all the people who are part of the taboo community, they see a lot of kind of unattractive elements there, and that makes it much harder to tell the truth about the taboo thing than it would otherwise be.
You chose to devote more than a year of your life to deconstructing Kevin MacDonald's theories on Jews and Judaism. Once you went down that path, that also, do you sense that pulled you along into a certain tide or flow or direction that shifted your life? You chose a particular scholarly endeavor, and then by virtue of embracing that scholarly endeavor, that endeavor is now shaping your life.
Certainly, I was influenced by that. After I received an MPhil in History and Philosophy of Science from Cambridge in 2016. And then I was unexpectedly rejected from the Cambridge PhD program, which I was sure I was going to be admitted to. And I didn't have time to apply to other programs before that, because I hadn't, after that, because I hadn't bothered to take the GRE, which was necessary only for American schools. So I had a year off in between. The year later, I was admitted to the Oxford PhD program, but I had a year in between. And I wrote 5 papers. The one on MacDonald was just one of the 5. I also wrote the one on race differences in intelligence, which was published in Philosophical Psychology, one on vegetarianism, one on paternalism and intelligence, and then a 5th, which wasn't published. So this, I didn't know that the paper on MacDonald would generate the response that it did, and I expected MacDonald would reply, and I thought that then I would write a rejoinder, and then that would be it. And that turned out not to be what happened. So I devoted much more time than I expected to that topic. But I've said, at this point, I've said most of what I want to say about Jews specifically. I'm still, now I'm very much interested in the question of where these ideas actually came from, why liberalism triumphed in the 20th century, what the future of liberalism is. And I feel that, to my satisfaction, I've ruled out the Jewish theory that this was all Jews seeking to advance their interests. But perhaps this helped lead me to my current interest in that topic.
I have to thank you for your essay on vegetarianism and the dangers thereof. I've been a lifelong vegetarian by force of habit, not really out of volition. And you kind of woke me up that this was pretty dangerous for my health. And so I struggled for years to try to find ways to ingest meat when my body has such a strong reaction against the very possibility of meat. Then approximately 2 years ago, I saw on Amazon grass-fed beef organ capsules. And I swear, Nathan, within 2 weeks of taking 6 beef organ capsules every day, all my lifelong health problems just disappeared. Now, it could be entirely a placebo effect, but it was incredibly powerful. I had a lifetime of poor health as a vegetarian, and now I feel strong, and I'm able to work out and do everything physically that I want to do. So I assume some other people were probably influenced by your article on vegetarianism as well.
No, no, I know that that had a lot of reach. It's been downloaded probably 75,000 times, and it was covered by the BBC in an article, which also got a lot of attention. A lot of people have said that they questioned the vegetarian, that led them to question vegetarian propaganda. And I wrote the paper that I would have wanted to read when I was a vegetarian. Uh, just like I tried to write the paper about race that I would have wanted to read when I was an environmentalist. Um, but yeah, and obviously everyone's different. People respond to diets differently, but for most people, vegetarianism is a terrible idea. And there's some conflicting evidence about the so-called placebo effect. There's a view that it's not even real, but I think even people who say that it's real think that it doesn't last more than like 6 months, is my understanding. So if the effect, if the benefit has lasted more than that, then it's very unlikely. It's pretty safe to say that it's real.
Do you think that you would have been able to do your dissident work if you were a more outgoing social personality, or has doing the dissident work, kind of pushed you away from socializing?
It's not the dissident work; it's the work. Um, Work takes a lot of work, and that means less time for other things. And there are a lot of dissident. There's a large dissident community. Not large, but I have plenty of friends, but I do focus a lot on the work, and then that leaves less time and energy for other things.
So how much time do you spend on your academic work as opposed to your popular productions on Twitter, Substack, and other publications?
The popular stuff is a very tiny percentage of my time. I mean, I lately I've been tweeting for me what's a lot, like sometimes a couple times a day. I often reply to people more than that, but a couple times. But no, I could go a few weeks without tweeting. I That's not my main focus. I spend most of my time on philosophy papers that don't necessarily have the same kind of audience as popular articles. Although sometimes my academic work actually is it's not clear where to draw the line between the academic and the popular, because a lot of my academic papers have on average more than 20,000 downloads each. So, I mean, that's a respectable record, even if you're writing on Substack, just popular oriented work. But yeah, most of my time is like in the last couple of years, I spent a huge amount of time on a paper in meta-ethics about the evolution of morality and the implications for the nature for the question of whether morality is real, or in what sense morality is objectively real. I just spent recently, over the last couple months, my main focus has been on a paper in evolutionary theory, which I would say, in my view, answers some important questions, but it's not may not have as much appeal as a magazine article.
Now, usually academics who achieve the level of popular attention that you've received aren't really getting much resonance in the academic community. How is the academic community, if at all, wrestling with your work?
In philosophy, there's definitely a lot of people who've read at least some of my work. In philosophy, everybody, I think, heard about the philosophical psychology paper that was dominated the philosophy news for a few weeks. Then people know about, some philosophers know about my paper in Philosopher on MacDonald. Then MacDonald wrote a reply, which was retracted, and one of the journal editors quit, and the other, it's not clear, he retired or left for some reason. But there's certainly a political element to whose work is recognized in philosophy. There definitely have been instances where people go out of their way not to acknowledge something that I've done, not to cite me, which I guess is annoying, but I am not too invested in that kind of recognition.
It's a little bit ironic that Kevin MacDonald's work did not receive serious academic attention until you came along about 20 years later after it was first published. It might be ironic if your work does not receive serious academic scrutiny for 20 years after you first started, publishing your most important articles.
That would be an interesting parallel, I suppose. But except in my case, it won't be refuted; it will be confirmed.
So. Okay, great. Any final words? Anything that you can add about your areas of academic research that you haven't already mentioned that we might, hope to read in the next few years?
Well, and there are different communities who believe that who associate me only with one aspect of my work that they're familiar with. So for some people, I'm just the racist, and for others, I'm the Jewish apologist, and for others, I'm the vegetarian, anti-vegetarian guy. For a smaller group, maybe knows me for my philosophy of biology work and then meta-ethics work. And then at the National Conservatism Conference, several people knew who I was because of only because of the Heterodox Academy article. There aren't many people who will be interested in all of those things, but yes, what I spend a lot of my time, most of my time on is the academic papers. If people are interested in the question, the field of meta-ethics is concerned with the nature of morality and whether it's real or it's just in our minds. I defend the view that morality is not real. It's the product of our moral beliefs are the product of non-truth tracking forces, and there's no reason, and they should be rejected as unjustified. So I have some papers on that. I'm particularly interested in why the question of why there's been cross-cultural convergence on liberalism. So one explanation for cross-cultural convergence on liberalism is that liberalism is just objectively correct. So everybody's has recognized the objective correctness of liberalism, and we converged on liberalism for the same reason we converged on scientific beliefs like the earth is round, because it is round. So I provide what are called debunking explanations for this kind of thing. So I explain convergence on liberalism in a way that doesn't posit objective moral truth, and so therefore we can reject objective moral truth as ontologically superfluous. So there, some of my work that the present, some of the listeners may not be familiar with if they're interested.
Do you have any thoughts on Richard Hanania? He seems to have successfully navigated being outed as, somewhat vulgar white nationalist when he was younger, and he seemed to have made an effective apology. He seems to have published an acclaimed book. Any thoughts on Hanania and how he navigated his outing?
He did that very well. He had it's fortunate for him that his views, which I'm not insinuating that they're insincere, just his views on topics like immigration and that sort of thing, put him in a certain camp that certainly aided his defense. But he was very skillful in how he handled that. And it's true that generally you shouldn't apologize, but in his case, the apology was the wise thing to do, because I think he really doesn't hold the beliefs of Richard Holst anymore. And so it made sense for him to explain why he thought that way, why he currently doesn't. So he handled that very well.
A very common critique by the people on the alt-right is that Jews have zero empathy for Europeans, but Europeans have considerable empathy for Jews. I don't think there's much difference in empathy and political orientation between European non-Jews and European Jews once you account for levels of IQ and secular education. What do you think?
Well, if the argument is that this is an innate difference, Europeans have showed themselves to be more than capable of not empathizing with people under the right conditions. Currently, do Jews have less empathy for European nationalist aspirations than the converse? It's not really comparing like with like. A lot of people perceive me as saying that Jews didn't do anything wrong and there's nothing wrong with Jews, which has never been my view and never been something that I've said or implied. There are many Jews who are a big part of the problem, and I've called them out. I continue to call them out. There are white Gentiles who are a big part of the problem, and I call them out as well. Most of what's happening in Europe that is disliked by the nationalists was orchestrated by the Europeans themselves. countries without Jews or with very few Jews have generally behaved similarly to countries with more Jewish influence. So um, trying to pin the blame on Jews specifically is, I think, a mistake, both empirically and strategically. Although in the short term, from a strategic point of view, you can kind of get people excited about being anti-Semitic. But I mean, at least now that, as of now, that doesn't have such widespread appeal, except among like the Muslims, who the alt-righters don't like either. Uh, so yeah, I think that I'm not saying there's no Jewish question, that there's nothing to see, that we shouldn't talk about this, we shouldn't comment on bad Jewish behavior, but people who think that that's the key to understanding everything, yeah, that's a big mistake.
Yeah. Okay, Nathan, great to talk to you. Thank you so much for giving me 2.5 hours of your time this morning.
Good to talk to you.
Okay, take care, man.